Hey, great day, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sirius Report with London Paul. And we are actually simulcasting this also to the Gadfly multi-channel network as well. This is part two to our follow-up of our discussion that we originally had, which I believe was on Monday of this week.
Yes.
So yes, I'm losing track of my days here, Paul, so bear with me.
Don't worry.
Basically, we just wanted to jump in and say, hi to everyone in the chat room, and enjoy your day, and we will reschedule this at some other point. April Fools, everyone. I'm sorry, that was a terrible joke. That was absolutely terrible to do to everyone. But it needed to be done. My son was all excited. Go ahead, Paul.
Do you know what? I was almost tempted to actually come on and say I've just had some news through that Putin's resigning at the end of this year.
Oh,
but I thought, no, don't do it.
Now that would be a very significant move. So, but thank you all for tuning in here, and those in the chat room. So, A Dix, Cowboy, Velas was in the house earlier. Ronan's there. So if you have not done so yet, make sure to jump over and visit the Gadfly.vhx TV. You can find out about our multi-channel network there. Also, the revamped site. So all of the Rogue News content now is one platform, roguenews.com. Get there. All of the content is there. It's kind of a one-stop shop for everything related to Rogue. And then also, Paul, don't forget to check out Paul's work over at thesiriusreport.com. So, Paul, welcome back, and excited to be doing part two of our geopolitical conversation regarding the realignment of the world order.
Well, yeah, and obviously, good. Well, it is. I have to. Yeah, good morning, CJ. I have to look at the clock to make sure I know what time it is. But yeah, and good morning, afternoon, evening. Not sure where you have people all over the world tuning in. So, yeah, we last time we kind of went through more the historical context, sort of pre-World War One, what happened, sort of during World War One, post-World War One, and then we kind of got up to and we integrated some of this whole sort of old world reality, the unipolar world, and the new sort of reality, the multipolar world, and how they are extremely different ways of nations being, in terms of governance, in terms of sovereignty, in terms of trying to make nations actually effectively work economically for the people, rather than the so-called 1%, which is actually not even, is fractions of 1%. Though it's not anywhere near as many people or many sort of what I call spheres of influence. Now, I had somebody on Twitter today getting in touch going, what do you mean by spheres of influence? So I thought I'd just throw that in before we start, because if someone just says cabal or deep state, what does it mean? And effectively, the political system is not a sphere of influence. The political system in Western nations is just a conduit to get policy decisions passed. Most of them are effectively largely influence foreign policy. Yeah, there are some domestic policy decisions. We've had periods in history like the Patriot Act in 2001 and things like that, but that's just, all of it is just rubber stamping a policy decision that's made by other entities. And yes, the financial system is one of them, but that is really a conduit for a whole bunch of other spheres of influence that are usually, to say, nefarious, disgusting. Effectively, it's a conduit which helps with nefarious activities that go on in the world that we know. And just to put this in context, we're back to this cashless society thing. Well, apart from the narco industry, which is $1 trillion a year that depends completely on cash, you've got all the other, where'd you start? Human trafficking, organ trafficking, slavery still. All these, prostitution and absolutely disgusting things. They're all rooted in cash. But the other thing that's worth noting is that, I'm not saying it's all banks, but banks have, and we said this before, tens of billions of dollars in cash that sit in certain banks and are used to finance and fund deals, so they can be transacted effectively through banks, but in cash. So there's no way of anybody actually realizing that those transactions have taken place. And this is why we have seen in history, and we don't need to go into particulars, where banks have been busted for laundering drug money, etc., etc., etc. So I sort of digress slightly there, but you kind of get the idea that there's those spheres of influence, the financial sector, which is a sphere of influence. There's big corporations. There's obviously the military-industrial complex. They're not all in agreement. They agree sometimes, they cooperate sometimes, but increasingly in the world we're living in now, as the West capitulates and collapses, they're not really cooperating anymore. It's dog eat dog, and they'll do anything to survive, which is why effectively you started to see the sort of big tech giants start trying to flex their muscles. One small point worth mentioning, and we did mention it last time, is when people looked at what was going on in China and their tech giants, this is why China stomped and stamped on the big tech companies, because they saw parallels with the West and saw their tech companies becoming the old reality, where we're not having this. We're not having any institution becoming so big that it threatens the governance structure of our country. So therefore, they took appropriate action and made amendments and effectively curtailed a lot of their power and influence. But going back to the point where we sort of left off, and we'll take it back slightly. Obviously, when we had the collapse of the Soviet Union in sort of obviously the late 80s, and then you had the emergence of the Yeltsin era, and the Yeltsin era very much took Russia back to the old reality where oligarchs, i.e., monopolies, control just about everything, and the West really, liked this kind of setup that was going on in Russia. I mean, to be honest, Yeltsin, it's debatable what he was doing most of the time, but he certainly gave all the power to the oligarchs, and the West was extremely happy that somehow, the Western model was going to grow and expand, obviously, inside Russia. And of course, lo and behold, prior to when Putin first became president in 2000, there was a push to try and get him in a bit sooner, and Putin went, I'm not ready to do this. I can't do this job. I'm not equipped. I don't have the understanding. I need to understand what it is I'm going to do, how I'm going to do it. And therefore, obviously, his kind of presidency was delayed a little bit. But the consequence of that was he immediately realized, based, as I say, on the fact of the discussions he had with what I call the architects of the new reality, and he realized, well, look, I first off need to rid the West of, or rid the Western influences, these oligarchs inside my nation, because ultimately they're going to gut the nation. They're going to turn it into a satellite of the West and destroy Russia. So that was the big initial move, was to say, okay, I have to deal with this. We have to find a way to start to curtail the influence of the oligarchs. And over a long period of time, 20 years now, that influence essentially is being curtailed, not entirely, but to the point that Russia is a completely sovereign nation. It's one of the few totally sovereign nations on the planet. China's another one. Iran's another one. North Korea, but North Korea is a completely bizarre case to discuss in those terms. There's a lot of other nations that are increasingly becoming more sovereign, but they still have the kind of old world reality that functions and exists in the nations. But increasing, that's diminishing, obviously.
Paul,
Yeah.
Can I pause you for just a moment, because I think at the start of that, in terms of the shift in power, was that post World War II where Russia had to try to emerge from a very lengthy war, and in good faith, didn't they start to align with the West, with the United States in terms of banking, debt, finance, which inevitably they took that on good faith, that was the right thing to do. Is that wrong, or an accurate assessment of?
No. The back end of World War II, that immediately the hostilities started to appear. I mean, okay, they sat there going, we're the Allied powers, and you had Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, but very quickly that relationship evaporated. Russia didn't trust the West effectively, and of course, I mean, it's complicated. It's extremely complicated. I'm not trying to simplify what happened inside Russia because it is extremely complicated. And I don't pretend to know every single aspect of Russian history. But what I would say is, really, it wasn't the intention of collapsing Russia, and the West was certainly behind collapsing communist, the Soviet Union was obviously it would of course free up all the like the Baltic republics and so Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, obviously Poland, etc., etc. So it broke up the whole Warsaw Pact, and then it left these nations where NATO could then start to encroach closer and closer to Russia. By collapsing it, they thought, well, that's the opportunity to westernize our army, and that's always the aim. The aim is to westernize these nations, make them be subservient effectively to the United States, and effectively then to lack independence and sovereignty, to be controlled by monopolies. And therefore the monopolies can be manipulated. They can control. I mean, Russia has enormous resources. It hasn't even explored 2/3 of its resources, and it's already got enormous resource base, as we know, in just about everything. Well, not just oil, gas. It has in gold. It even has large reserves in silver, and practically, obviously, notwithstanding its enormous food production, etc., etc. So that was the intention from the Western perspective, was to kind of wrestle control of Russia, which of course, and then enter the stage Putin, and then all bets were off. But what I would say, and I don't want to appear too critical of, but I would, in one sense, of Putin, but I think he was extremely naive in terms of how he initially handled. I think he thought, well, I'm going to keep the sovereignty of my nation, but maybe I can integrate. I mean, there was talk at one point of Russia maybe joining the euro. Putin even expressed interest in joining NATO. Now, you can see the logical reason why you would do that, but ultimately, of course, that never came to pass. I don't think Russia particularly saw 9/11 as anything other than conventional wisdom suggested at the time. They most certainly don't believe that now. So obviously, Russia was going through this rebuilding process, and Europe and the United States, etc., really kind of, I think, felt that, well, we can get him on side. We'll kind of continue to try and sort of chip away and westernize Russia. And kind of what really started to change the emphasis was, I think in 2007, Putin, and I want to talk in a bit of detail what Putin said back in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, because he turned up and you look at all the Western audience that were there, and Merkel was there, etc., and they were almost welcoming him with open arms. And he made this speech basically start, I can be candid amongst people, and so hopefully, you won't get too angry with me what I've got to say. But he kind of made it very clear by 2007 that his earlier kind of beliefs and aspirations about how Russia could integrate into the West were kind of over and done with. And it was very obvious. I mean, it's kind of interesting that I didn't really reflect at the time, because I wasn't, given what I was doing as a job, I didn't have time to look at international geopolitics the way obviously I do now, and I didn't really pay particular attention to what Putin said at the time. But obviously, from my perspective, the Western financial system was in disarray. There was going to be a collapse of some description. I didn't know it would happen in 2008, but I certainly knew it was pretty imminent. But he stood up at this, obviously, the security conference in Munich, and he made a number of extremely interesting points. It's worth obviously going back to the fact that the kind of what I call the architects of the new reality, the reset, whatever you want to call it, they obviously had meetings with the Chinese and the Russians, so therefore including Putin. And I kind of interesting upon reflection when you look in 2007, where he came out with a whole bunch of points. And I think this is pretty significant because this for me was the turning point when the West went, hang on a minute, we're not going to get Putin on side. This is a sort of fundamental, kind of almost ideological turning point in their mindset. They kind of started off all before he starts speaking, but you could see by the end of it, they're thinking, hang on, what's going on? And he said, for example, like he said, it's well known that international security comprises much more than issues relating to military and political stability. And he actually said it involves the stability of the global economy. That was, I think, a big hint as to what was coming. And he talked about the need to overcome poverty and have economic security. And he said to develop a dialogue, what he referred to as civilizations. And he said, talking about the Cold War era and how, that there was these ideological stereotypes, double standards, and all typical aspects of Cold War thinking that went on at the time. And then he made a point where he said the unipolar world that has been proposed after the Cold War, note, did not take place either, meaning even in 2007, it was very obvious it had failed. And where he was kind of maybe a bit wide-eyed when he came along initially, thinking, well, we can have some integration, he realized that was effectively trying to sucker Russia into a unipolar world. And he said, basically, what is a unipolar world? He said, one might embellish this term, but at the end of the day, it refers to one type of situation, namely one center of authority, one center of force, and one center of decision making. He said it is a world in which there is one master, one sovereign. And at the end of the day, this is pernicious not only for all those within the system, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys itself within. So there's a recollection. Now, go back to what I said to the architects of the reset. They sat down, being visionaries, which they were at the time, and said, look, this unipolar world is dead. It's dying already. It has no longevity. This is why you need to start thinking differently about the future, about how this new reality can unfold. And these are sort of ideas. But the fact is, as he said, the sovereign itself, meaning the United States, the unipolar world, is going to destroy itself from within. That is exactly what, we're sat here, 14 years or so later. And that is exactly what happened. And he said, of course, all this has nothing in common with democracy. And he talked about how Russia is supposed to be taught about democracy, but for some reason, those who teach us don't want to learn themselves. So he talked about how the unipolar world was unacceptable, but also impossible in today's world. And that's not only because if there was an individual leadership in today's world, then he said military, political, and economic resources would not suffice. Absolutely true. And he said what is even more important is the model itself is flawed because at its basis there is and can be no moral foundations for modern society. These are, you imagine the ensemble of this audience, all these Western leaders and military personnel and dignitaries, and they're looking at him going, hang on a minute. He's basically lambasting the world that we stand up for. So it was an enormous wake-up call. And he talked obviously about how all this unipolar world's not resolved anything. It's created enormous human tragedy and new centers of tension, and how we're witnessing at that point this, he called it a hyper use of military force in international relations that plunges the world into this endless, what he called abyss of permanent conflicts, which is exactly what the United States wants, endless conflict, because endless conflict suits its justification for military supremacy as it perceives, even though it has no military supremacy, but more importantly, justifies spending obscene amounts of US dollars every year, 750 billion or whatever it was. I don't know what it was back then off the top of my head. But clearly that's the justification. He said, obviously, it was there was utter disdain for the basic rules of international law. And of course, he pointedly said one state of course. First and foremost, the United States overstepped its national borders in every way. And it talked about how it imposes its economic, political, cultural, and educational policies on the rest of the world. It creates all this fear, creates arms races. And he made the point, obviously, in 2007, thinking, I'm like probably a lot of people in this position would have done in 2007. They would have sat there and gone, look, we know that the West is going to collapse economically. This could be the end, because truthfully, nobody at that point could have envisaged they'd have spent the next 13 years trying to save something that was irretrievable, the problem. They just have delayed their day with destiny, and we're rapidly approaching that day. But at the point back then, he said, we've reached this kind of point where we have to seriously think about changing things about the architecture of global security. He talked about how even back in 2007, when you looked at the purchasing power parity of, just take India and China, those two nations alone at that point, it was greater than that of the United States. He talked about what was, because they didn't have the BRICS then, it was just the BRIC countries, because South Africa came afterwards. He talked about how the GDP of Brazil, Russia, India, and China was greater at that point than the cumulative GDP of the EU. And this is what he actually said back in 2007. This is the basis of the multipolar world. So he was already telegraphing what the future was going to be. And this was on the basis that at this point he'd had these, discussions both with the architects and internally about, we need a new reality. The old reality is collapsing. And he talked about how we need, okay, whatever we think of the UN, there need to be a proper charter of the UN. It can't be, we can't have military force dictated by NATO. Or he mentioned the EU. Of course, the EU is not dictating military force, but he was highlighting the fact there needs to be a global way of dealing with global problems. Talked about, obviously, about weapons destruction and reducing nuclear weapons, about the need to prevent the militarization of outer space, and he said, I think it's obvious that NATO expansion doesn't have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with the ensuring security in Europe. It's just to be a serious provocation. It reduces the level of mutual trust. And this, at this point, was when Russia was going, hang on, you're just pushing the boundaries of NATO. After, okay, naively Gorbachev believed that the West wouldn't do this. I mean, that's utter naivety. And of course, they were obviously always going to do it. And that's when he was pushing the point that they're trying to push this failed unipolar world experiment that never got off the ground. And this is one thing, and it's got nothing to do with security. They just want to create provocation. They want to terrify the Baltic states and Poland, reduce mutual trust between Russia and Europe. And why? And we've said this before, because the worst nightmare is if you have a unified Eurasia incorporating Russia and Europe, for all the reasons we discussed in part one, that would just disappear. So all the effort they put in for 100+ years to try and subjugate and turn Europe into a vassal state was over. It would have been over in the blink of an eye. So I said, Merkel came out tomorrow and went, right, and we're leaving the European Union. We're going to form a trade investment pact with Russia, and we're going to start discussing European security. It would be over. It would just the European Union would disintegrate. The US's control over Europe would just evaporate in the blink of an eye. And he was kind of alluding to the fact that ultimately, at some point in the future, this is the way it was going to be. But at that point, there was all these divisions. They're trying to build walls between us. The Russians wanted non-proliferation. They wanted that they would have a fair crack at the energy sector, and that their economic security would adhere to Western principles. It's the kind of win-win situation. Talked about, obviously, how the Middle East had been manipulated, and therefore there was a risk of global destabilization. And he said it is obvious that the world's leading countries should see this destabilization as a threat, and that they therefore should build more democratic first system of global economic relations, a system, note, that would give everyone the chance and the possibility to develop, a la the multipolar world. And he's then obviously, so that you can kind of get the gist. You can go and find it on the internet. It's about 30 minutes long, the speech. I mean, we could go on and talk a bit more, but you get the idea. It was, for me, a fundamental turning point in terms of what Russia was saying. The unipolar world never existed. And note how a couple of months back, Putin reiterated precisely the same statement, that it never existed. And this is this unipolar world, this one world governance nonsense and all the stuff that lots of people out there love to tell everyone is reality. It was never a reality. It never got off the ground. There was a desire to push this, but again, it's this massive oversimplification of, does these people, they control everything. They control the central banks of the world. They control all corporations. They control everything. And it doesn't matter, because they control Russia. They control China. And at some point, they're going to control the entire world and turn us all into feudalism, or whatever variant that people want to suggest. That is never being a reality. It was never a reality 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or even now. And never more so now than when you look at this new reality, where huge sections of the world are now going, well, we never liked this attempt by the Americans to create a unipolar world, but now we've got the confidence and the ability to actually go out and say, you know what, we're going to stand up for our sovereignty. We want to stand up for this new reality. We like what this new reality is. It's a win-win cooperation. It's not subjugating nations. It's not threatening nations, bombing nations, sanctions, regime change, wars, and everything, because that's not what the future's about. The world had enough of all that. It wants to embrace this change. And we'll come to the point of what the whole purpose, and go into a bit more detail what the whole sort of new Silk Road is, which became the One Belt, One Road, which is now the Belt and Road Initiative. And Putin kind of made the point really right at the end of his speech, when he said, he's talking about the kind of old world. He said that obviously he heard from his European partners that Russia should play an increasingly active role in world affairs. And he said, Russia is a country with a history that spans more than 1,000 years and has practically always used the privilege to carry out note and independent foreign policy. He says, we're not going to change this today, but at the same time, we are well aware of how the world is changing, and we have a realistic sense of our own opportunities and potential. So, of course, we'd like to interact with responsible note and independent note partners with whom we could work together in constructing note a fair and democratic world order, not a new world order, meaning a new reality, a multipolar world that would ensure note security and prosperity, not only for a select few, but for all. So you can kind of get the idea why I've made a big play of talking about this, because it's an enormously significant turning point, not only in Western attitudes, but by that point, Russia had reached the end of their patience, effectively. And there was things we'll talk about that just solidified Russia's attitude. But their attitude was, the unipolar world never got off the ground. Anyone who has any belief that it's going to, it's not. I'm going to put the stake in the ground that this is the multipolar world, this is the future. And he actually specifically, as I just said, mentioned the word multipolar world. And that was, for me, is a point in history where it's worth mentioning in some detail, because it was that significant.
Absolutely, Paul. That was perfect breakdown, and that helped significantly. Now let's think in terms of how that evolved from that discussion in regards to the multipolar world. Was it the formation of the European Union that really pressured or pushed Russia at that time to say, hey, we're not so much happy about what's taking place here? How much did the European Union formation impact things. Everything leading up from Crimea to the Ukraine, because there were still continued attempts all through that, whether it's the Council of Foreign Relations, the people that really dictate U.S. foreign policy, because it's not Americans that dictate foreign policy. It's an elite group of class of people that decides that, and it's very relevant because not only did we witness under Donald Trump, but we're witnessing the very exact same thing under Biden. So the whole illusion of choice in regards to who holds the Oval Office dictates very little in terms of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned the aspect. I mean, obviously, China had the economic capability more than Russia had the economic capability. Yeah, Russia is not a poor nation. I mean, it in the sense that in terms of its kind of fiscal, projections, it has a long way still to go to resolve its internal problems in terms of bettering the livelihoods of all Russians. It's a little way behind where China is, where China's now eradicated poverty as they define it, which is across by the end of 2020. That was a long-term ambition going back sort of 5 years in the 5-year plan, and they've succeeded in doing it. And I'm not going to get stuck in that particular conversation, but there are some incredible examples of how this was achieved. But anyway, going back to the point that we now sort of get to 2008, and obviously we had the global financial crisis, and of course Russia and China were quite well insulated to handle this. It didn't affect them like it affected Western nations. Why? Because they knew it was coming. They made the appropriate steps to try and mitigate the fallout of that crisis. And what did China do while the West was scratching its head trying to work out how it was going to prevent collapse? China, for example, went through one of the biggest spending sprees it's ever had. In fact, they're now going through another big spending spree. What they do is, when the rest of the world sat there extremely concerned about its future economic financial situation, China then goes on a huge spending spree, not just for the sake of it. We're not talking about a Biden infrastructure bill, and that's a conversation for another day. But 2008 was an important turning point for the Chinese in their relationship with the United States. Obviously, the relationship was somewhat different than the Russian one with Europe and the United States, because China didn't have NATO breathing down its neck. I mean, obviously, we know China was brought into the WTO, and the United States moved a lot of its manufacturing base to China, and people get particularly angry and criticize the Chinese for that. Well, it wasn't. It was the West did that. It was just pure greed, because things could be manufactured a lot cheaper there, so it increased the margins and profit that corporations could make by producing goods there and selling them into the West. But the turning point in 2008 was prior to this. China had this very kind of symbiotic relationship that they always said, well, okay, we're selling you all this stuff, so we'll buy all your US treasuries, and we'll give you a whole bunch of free dollars, and you can buy more stuff. And they went, okay, well, this kind of is okay. We can live with this. And what annoyed them hugely was the fact that prior to 2008, the US wouldn't give them their gold back, and the Chinese got really angry about this. And one of the side effects of this is they dumped enormous loads of mortgage bonds, which didn't exactly help with what subsequently unfolded in subprime issues in 2008. But what angered them even more was they said, we've got this relationship with America, with treasuries of dollars. And then the US suddenly went, well, we're just printing a whole bunch of money. And China went, hang on a minute. We're not exactly too thrilled about this. So you can now just suddenly, you've decided you're just going to print money for the sake of printing money for whatever reason, and it's never stopped since 2008. And at that point, they went, this relationship doesn't work anymore. The trust is gone. They're not treating, they've completely just carved up this kind of agreement we had. And also, what does that mean in terms of dollars? What does that mean in terms of us holding treasuries? and they started to get extremely nervous and anxious about the future direction of the relationship. And of course, it wasn't entirely that point when the relationship began to sort of crater, what I would term, in to the extent it is now. You only have to look back that in terms of the development of the multipolar world, we had what was the BRIC, which was Brazil, Russia, India, and China. South Africa came afterwards. Now they since 2009 they've met annually in formal summits, and they were formed in 2006. That was kind of an embryonic form of the start of the multipolar world. Problem is, Russia and China have been okay, but India has issues with China, and the West is trying to play on that. The West is, I mean, we've seen what's happened in Brazil in recent years. Now we've got Bolsonaro, etc., who's really just a Western kind of puppet. And South Africa's just got enormous economic, political, social issues. It's still a huge problem. So it hasn't really kind of got off the ground, but it's been superseded by a whole bunch of other things. But the point is, it was formed in 2006. So at that point, China's looking at the world going, hang on. They were aware of the economic turmoil that was coming to the West. And so therefore, it wasn't exactly a eureka moment in terms of changing attitudes, because bear in mind, they had gone through this process in the late 90s as well, and early 2000s, with the idea of the architects of the reset, who said, look, the unipolar world, which doesn't really exist, is going to collapse. It's got a finite life. We don't know whether it's a decade or 20 years or 30 years, but you need to start changing. You need to start reinvigorating what was the old Silk Road. So you need to return to sound money. You need to back your currency with gold, etc., and start to formulate different relationships. You're going to have to start internationalizing what you do in terms of your relationships. You're going to have to eventually become the ascendant sort of power, but ascendant kind of aspect of the new reality, kind of the focal point. Therefore, you're going to end up eventually having to open your markets up and change your whole ethos. And you can't do this in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. You're going to have, but you need to start putting these processes in place. So, course, we've seen, particularly post 2008, the sort of birth of what was, as I said, the New Silk Road, or the One Belt, One Road, and that was effectively countries situated on the original old Silk Road. So Central Asia, Western Asia, the Middle East, Europe. Obviously, China had been already quite heavily involved to some degree in Africa, but then by extension, it's in Africa. It's now in Central America and South America. In fact, it's pretty much, I mean, in terms of Chinese investment inside the US, I don't think the US realizes how much in influence China already has internally. Some people will get extremely upset about that, but I'd be far more upset about the insanity that's been running the United States for too many decades. But of course, we know what the Silk Road is. It was this huge network of road, railways, pipelines. It connects China's east coast with Europe. They wanted to create this Eurasian land bridge. And then, you've got all these 5 regional corridors that branch off the land bridge. So you've got, you remember, Mongolia and Russia in the north. You've got Southeast Asia. You had Pakistan and Bangladesh in the south, Central Asia, West Asia, and of course, ultimately Europe. And the dream was to turn it from Vladivostok in the east to Lisbon in Portugal in the west. And then you had the Maritime Silk Road, which is Southeast Asia, Oceania, North Africa. Then you got the South China Sea, the South Pacific Ocean, and then the wider Indian Ocean area. And, the idea was this is home to 4 billion people. It's potentially the biggest market in the world. And if you put integration of these regions into an economic area, then you can build all this infrastructure, broaden trade. You have this enormous cultural exchanges. So China started internally, and they did this enormous infrastructure rebuild, and they built. And people said they're building ghost cities. They're just employing people to build nothing. Now, these so-called ghost cities ended up populated because they were part of a Chinese plan to build strategic areas within China as part of their internal development with a long-term 10, 20, 30, 50-year development. And a lot of people in the West go, the Belt and Road's finished. The Belt and Road hasn't even started. It's got 50 to 100 years more development. Never mind all the development we've seen, and we've looked at all the policy coordination, all the trade deals, investment, trade, cooperation. You've got financial integration, mutual cooperation, and just treaty after treaty. In bilateral terms, trilateral terms, you've got the multilateral trade deals like RCEP is one example. And then, of course, China's signed this enormous investment deal with the EU that the US is currently trying to obviously gate crash and destroy, and that revolves around, in part, what's going on in Ukraine. But that's a whole, again, some separate discussion. So if you look back into sort of the middle 2000s, 2010, sort of to 2015, 16, 17, obviously Xi Jinping they visited dozens of countries and, promoted this vision for a new reality. And we want to boost global trade, help countries coordinate economic policies, embrace this 4.5 billion people, and put this enormous trillions of dollars of investment. And people go, China just printed money, or no, China has enormous forex reserves, far bigger than the West understands. I mean, I think it's probably now 12 trillion, but they've spent 2 trillion of equivalent to dollars, and that's another policy decision. We have all this money, we're going to spend the dollars, we don't want this, but we're going to make investment decision. And it's a win-win cooperation, not trying to bankrupt the West and bankrupt these nations, like the West did with the IMF and the World Bank. So, I mean, as I say, by about 2016, they'd already invested nearly $1 trillion into the project across the world. And what they're doing is, the idea is, by investing this, we can create 2, 3, 4 times this in trade within a decade, and realize value that benefits, yes, the Chinese, of course, but also benefits all these other nations. And obviously there was the ASEAN nations in Southeast Asia, and this is where we then sort of factor in things like they created these multilateral funds. So there was the Silk Road Fund, the AIIB, which people have heard of, and the New Development Bank. Now, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank was this bank dedicated to lending to infrastructure projects, and it's had some progress. But again, this is future proofing. I mean, okay, the only principal nation that didn't sign up to it was the US. Even the UK signed up to it. So this is the big thing. It is financed with Chinese capital. The West always likes to go, no, it's financed with Chinese debt. But you look at it, it's to do with transportation, all the infrastructure we've just described, looking at resources and connectivity projects. So, and then obviously say, okay, we've got this capital, we're going to invest in all these areas we've just described. But first, you have to connect them all up. So you have to put all the infrastructure in, the backbone that links all these regions up and gives nations who have huge potential the opportunity to be part of this new reality. So therefore, on that basis, what that allowed the China to do was to build out this new reality. And what they've achieved in a decade, and people say you're always positive about China. I've talked about the negatives about China, and they're not what the West think. But what China's achieved in the last decade is astonishing. I mean, anyone who's been to China, lives in China, worked there, knows what I'm talking about. The developments they've made is something that is unprecedented in history. And it doesn't mean there are not problems, there are teething problems, there are issues, but nations who've signed up to it are far happier to be dealing with this new reality rather than the old reality where they were never able to achieve any of their objectives, to maximize their capability as a nation, because they were always terrified of trying to work in non-dollar terms, trying to have win-win cooperation, because nations across the world have been subjugated for centuries, not just by what the American policy was. We had all the colonial rule of the British and all those, which is a whole different sort of subject matter in history. But that's kind of going to where we are today, and literally every day of every week of every month, you can go and pick on something the Chinese are doing. And in tandem with that, we've started to see Russia do likewise. And there were certain sort of pivot points militarily and geopolitically where then Russia looked at things and went, hang on, we're not happy about this. And some of the very obvious ones was the Arab Spring, which was during the Obama era. When they looked at that and saw what happened with Gaddafi and what happened with Libya, and obviously there was Tunisia as well, they looked at it and went, this is unacceptable. They knew precisely what the Western aim and intentions were with regards to the Arab Spring. And then
Yes.
you rightly mentioned Ukraine, and that's we've talked at length, but Ukraine was purely an exercise in, and that was the Obama era, where they said, right, we want to drag Russia into a Vietnam. We want to sucker them into a war, so then we can sanction them to oblivion. We'll get they'll never be, they'll just be bogged down in this war, and it will economically destroy them. We'll sanction them to oblivion, and we're going to take down Russia. And of course, it failed completely, not least because Russia knew 12 months before Ukraine happened that was, the Maidan, what the intention was. So, and that's kind of, interestingly, it's kind of this civil war, as they refer to it, which in the Donbass has been rumbling on. The West never reports it, but there's war crimes happening there every single day of every single month of every single year for 7 years. And now we're starting to see this escalation again, and that's because the US is desperate to get Russia sucked into another war or some conflict, so it can justify to the Europeans, you need to sanction Russia even more, even though there's nothing left to sanction and they're pointless. But actually, we really want you to do this so we can justify switching off Nord Stream 2, which of course the US is desperately trying to prevent the completion of the project, which I think is now 96% complete. Then, of course, we had the Syrian war, and that changed enormous amounts of perception, particularly from the Russians' perspective, and also the Chinese, not just obviously within the Middle East, but just we're looking at those two principal nations, which is why Russia went, right, we're getting involved, because we know that if we don't, Assad's going to capitulate, and we're going to have a massive theater of conflict, far worse than, and what's happened in Syria is an appalling situation, and it would have been even worse. You imagine who knows what would have happened if Assad hadn't effectively been backstopped by the Russians, and it changed the whole war. And we know the reasons why the Syrian war happened, because effectively Assad wouldn't agree to put energy pipelines across.
Paul, if I could
Syria.
also interject just real quick, I think in terms of the core of the matter, in terms of when you look at all these different areas, whether it's Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, where specifically the root cause for the intervention policies and the attempt to do so were, in Libya, where many of these areas where they were trying to either change the course of influence, where several of these countries were looking to evolve outside of the IMF, the central banking system, and establish something different, and also pivot to more of the multipolar world. Every one of these countries where we've attempted Taiwan, and why? Because they want to keep the status quo in terms of dollar dominance, the IMF, the central bank processes, where that was the core of these intervention policies that took place.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there was historical context of this so-called Greater Israel project, which is doomed and will never succeed, but also because as the multipolar world was growing and expanding, it was moving into the Middle East. And it's probably more mature in the Middle East now. We've seen recent developments, very significant developments between the Chinese and the Saudis and the Russians and the Saudis. And we've talked, that moment of high-fiving between MBS and Putin. That was done for the cameras for very, very specific reasons. But yes, absolutely, it's trying to prevent the growth and expansion of the new reality, which is sovereign nations, self-determination, win-win cooperation. We're going to build economies that benefit the nation, your people. We're going to integrate people. We're going to break down these barriers. We're not going to allow this kind of divide and conquer mentality that exists in the West. And all the things that the United States, US hegemony, the US dollar just finds abhorrent, which is actually, they're the ones that have the abhorrent policy decisions. And that's the whole purpose of why we've seen this move by Russia to therefore start to move into the Middle East and the influence they're having. And obviously, we had the JCPOA agreement. Okay, Trump walked away from it. We've talked about that before. But the point is you've got now Russia, China backstopping Iran. Russia, China have influence across the Middle East in Iraq. Some degree of it. I mean, Lebanon's a very complicated nation at the moment. It's going through enormous internal problems, but that's a whole separate subject. But basically, the landscape of the Middle East is changing, and Saudi being one of the obvious nations. And what did the Saudis come out the other day is, we are ensuring that we will provide the energy needs of China for the next 50 years.
Yes.
That tells you the future direction and how the world's changing. So the other important fact that really, really angered both the Chinese and the Russians, and this was an Obama era thing where they turned into sanction junkies. They were literally sanctioning anything and everything they wanted. I mean, obviously we had Ukraine as one example, and then Trump took over and he became, his Trump administration was sanction junkies, and now Biden's in and it's more sanction junkies. But this, effectively, this was one of the drivers that made Russia, China, and the world go, we don't want to trade in dollars anymore. We want to move away from dollars because we don't trust you, because you could just switch us off from SWIFT, like you've done with the Iranians. But they thought, okay, Iran's one example, as bad as that is. But when you start doing it to Russia and you start sanctioning anyone who you don't agree with, it was, in hindsight, a ridiculously ludicrous Obama administration policy. But for the multipolar world, it was the shot in the arm it needed. And the Ukraine Maidan was a big, huge turning point and no surprise, we had the Maidan. And within months, there was the so-called Holy Grail energy deal between the Chinese and the Russians, which is now live and pumps enormous amounts of gas. And there's another pipeline coming online. And Russia's now sort of going, well, if you don't want Nord Stream 2, Europe, we don't care, because do you know what? Southeast Asia is very happy to take all our gas because it's going to be very cheap for them. So you're going to be the ones who are going to be left high and dry, but that's your choice. So these were kind of pivot points. The Maidan was a hugely significant one, not in terms of understanding US policy, but the whole sanctions thing. The whole de-dollarization process started to gather momentum enormously in the last, 5-6 years or so. And the Ukraine Maidan was the turning point in terms of attitudes towards, well, what's our perception of the dollar and whether it's a reliable currency for us to hold anymore, because we don't know. Tomorrow, the US may decide to cut us off from SWIFT. Now, and that would have devastating consequences. So what did Russia do? Yeah, they sanctioned them. They went, fine. We won't have dollars anymore. We'll dump all the treasuries. You don't want to trade with us, Europe. Well, that's your problem. We'll just go and find some import substitutions. We'll go and trade with other nations. And now Europe's screaming because they've lost enormous amounts of trade, and Russia's going, well, sorry, but we're not going to give up our trading partner, the new ones we have, because we believe in honoring our agreements and relationships. You were the ones who walked away. Okay, the US forced you because you're just a vassal continent who, when the US says jump, you say how high. But you're going to have to live with those consequences, and that's fundamentally your problem and not our problem. Now, ultimately, of course, at some point down the line, integration of Europe and Russia, it will happen, and that's the completion, effectively, of the Eurasian axis. But in that sense, that they were some pivotal points. The sanctions, the Ukraine made down. Of course, subsequently, what we've seen with regards to the last 12 months, and people still, well, for whatever reason, go, well, the pandemic, it's all part of this plan. And I cannot stress enough, it absolutely isn't. It's the end of it's fine. It's like hammering in the last few nails in the coffin lid of the unipolar world, the US empire, whatever you want to call it. And because now, of course, the rest of the world's looking at this going, well, we definitely don't want to hold dollars now, even if we're not worried about being sanctioned into oblivion, because the US just prints trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And it's not for economic growth, it's to stop the nation collapsing. And therefore, this is why we've seen this huge acceleration in recent months of trade deals with, like the RCEP with China and the European investment deal, and Russia signing deals, military cooperation, trade deals, and everything. And then wherever China goes, Russia goes. If Russia goes first, China goes, or China goes first, Russia goes. And they're
Paul.
just moving. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, Paul, I think I think the nail in the coffin may not have been COVID. I think the nail in the coffin was the election of a completely incompetent, mentally incoherent individual like Joe Biden that was the nail in the coffin. I think when the rest of the world established that is when they associated and said, okay, it's time to move on. It's time to we care about the people of America and its people, but Washington D.C. and the establishment no longer align with that. And and I'm sorry to phrase it that way, but I think it speaks volumes when everything that's transpiring, everything's happening, and the Biden administration first move was to say, I want to have a climate summit with Xi Jinping and Putin and talk about the climate.
Well, but let's go back. I mean, people can discuss what the reality of the Trump administration was, but you want to talk about pivot points. Trump's attitude towards the Chinese was a massive turning point when the Chinese looked at them and went, forget it. This is absolutely pointless. You're not trying to be an economic competitor. You are trying to make accusations. I mean, the whole Xinjiang thing, to say it infuriates the Chinese is an understatement. And they have absolutely every right to be infuriated, because the story about persecuting Muslims in Xinjiang is a complete lie. And I know for a fact, as I've said many times, because I've been there, seen it with my own eyes. So I'm not basing it on what somebody told me, because unless you've been there, then you can't. Then you're basing your judgment on what someone else has told you. It's complete nonsense. But these were factors that infuriated the Chinese. The Russians kind of were sort of, okay, well, Trump's. It is what it is. They didn't particularly trust him. They didn't distrust him. They knew he was hamstrung by the whole Russiagate nonsense, which we know is absolutely rubbish. But the point was, they didn't see any progress. They were furious about, in one sense, not because economically it would have impacted Russia with Nord Stream 2, but they were very angry that Trump proceeded because it showed a lack of trust, showed a lack of desire to have any form of cooperation. Okay, you make the point about Biden, but when Biden was elected, the Russians actually thought on some level, albeit very briefly, that Biden was a seasoned kind of Beltway guy, and there might be some way of being able to reason with him. Okay, forget all the issues, whatever's going on with Biden, and the fact he's not really the president. But very quickly that evaporated. But I wouldn't say that it's part of the process of this change, where when you start calling Putin a killer, and you the whole attitude with China and Russia, and how the Biden administration is behaving is accelerating the process. But COVID was, in a way, because it highlighted to the Chinese and the Russians just how weak economically the United States was, because it wasn't like, well, actually, yeah, we've got a bit of a problem, but we're gonna they within a week or two, the US was screaming, we need to print trillions of dollars, we need to bail everything out. And at that point, the Chinese and the Russians looked at the United States and went, well, you're in huge trouble. The sort of collapse of this empire is worse than we probably envisaged. I mean, at times it's quite hard for people, even for the Chinese and the Russians, to accept economically and in a fiscal sense, and just how weak the United States is. But that really highlighted to them, they're literally having to bail anything and everything out, and repeatedly. And what's $1 trillion today when you need $1 trillion next week? I mean, Biden's talking about, forget the infrastructure bill, we're going to need more fiscal stimulus, but that's it. It's a bottomless pit. It's a black hole. It just sucks dollars in, stops the collapse, doesn't produce any economic growth, any stability. It's just keep throwing money into it, because if we don't, everything collapses. So that will accelerate the process of actions that the Chinese and the Russians will take. So, I mean, that was going on during the Trump era, but we knew, and we said this, with Ken, and we've had discussions previously where we said the big difference in that regard between Trump and Biden is the acceleration of the collapse will be quicker with Biden, because Biden will try and print an awful lot more money than Trump did in relative terms, and in some sense that is absolutely correct. So there are a lot of kind of mitigating factors and that have kind of shaped policy decisions. But as we said, Ukraine was a big turning point in terms of trust in a relationship, but also the economic imperative and considerations. And I've always said this is not time driven, it's event driven. And the West has done certain things that accelerated this event driven, what I call event driven scenario. We talked about the Munich Security Conference with Putin in 2007, big, huge turning point. What I also will say, 2018, early March, when Putin came out and told the Duma that effectively admitted to Russia's military capability. That was an enormous turning point, because it was finally the realization in the West, even though the US is militarily light years behind Russia, that it was a reality. That sharpened a lot of minds. Forget the lunacy inside the Beltway. There's a lot of people in the military who are very, very pragmatic. They think about things. They understand the theater of conflict, and they've looked at things and gone, we do not want to go to war with Russia. We don't want to have a conflict in North Korea. We don't want any more conflict in Syria. I mean, that was one of the reasons why Mattis, of all people, said to Trump, do not launch missile strikes in Syria. Absolutely do not do this. I mean, it's like you talk about flaws. The killing of Soleimani, which was undertaken during the Trump administration, was one of the most, ludicrous policy decisions that's made. It's a bit like the equivalent, as I said, was like Iran going to kill Pompeo or something. I mean, it's just on a level of stupidity, and it's having far-reaching, profound, ramifications to this day, and it's shaping a huge move away from the US in the Middle East, and a complete lack of trust, because there's a kind of code of honor that says whatever you may think about your adversaries, you do not go around killing people of that magnitude and importance. Yes. And correct. So we could talk for hours about all the little.
Well, I think what I propose is that we in this session, which has been very informational. I'm going to have to go back and listen to it again, and then perhaps Paul, in part 3 of our discussion of dissecting the multipolar economic world, we can discuss the transition period that's happening, and then massive reform literally that will need to take place in the United States in regards to social everything regarding the social aspect of it that you've hinted on. I always didn't see it away, but we've been conditioned here in the United States when we hear that word socialism that we think instantly of the Venezuela, the things, but it's pretty unique in terms of some of the things that have been created in Russia, China, in regards to some of the programs to help people, versus here in the United States, most of these programs have been developed really to benefit the corporations, individuals, the banks, versus its people. Maybe we can talk about that massive change that will have to occur.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. We can. Yes, I mean it, and let's not just solely pick on the United States. The UK's has to. Europe does. And various parts of the world are in various stages of this development of integrating into the multipolar. Or there's still nations who are kind of straddling the two. There's great fear in certain nations that the US could just cause some sort of coup attempt. They could have a regime attempt in their nations, but we've also, there are certain encouraging developments where you can see how their attempts to squeeze. I mean, we didn't even discuss what happened in Belarus with the failed color revolution, what went on, where the US was agitating in Armenia and Azerbaijan. And this was all, again, trying to confront the Russia via the back door in a kind of roundabout way. But we can't talk about everything. We'd literally be here for weeks. But for me, on a separate note, with my own podcast, all these developments, but since we started, we cover we do the financial stuff, obviously, but we cover all these developments in as much detail as we can. Bearing in mind, we can't discuss everything. And as I've said to you, I literally have, going back 4 or 5 years, thousands of developments I've never discussed, because I don't simply have enough time, because I can't discuss everything. But the developments that have happened in terms of the multipolar world are astronomical. And it's this one point, because I often get people going, "You're always positive about China." Well, here's the point. In terms of China's perspective in foreign policy decisions, it's a breath of fresh air compared to the United States. China's problems are not how it deals. I mean, there are aspects it could improve in foreign relations, but it's learning quickly. China also can adopt some of the positive things in the West and integrate it into its own country. And it has its own internal challenges. And, that's something we can probably discuss in part 3. So, but all I'm doing is reporting what's happening. I don't take sides. It's not about winning. The world's changing. This is the way the world's moving. And we have to accept this is the new reality. The old reality is dying. It's pointless hanging on to it. It doesn't mean China's going to take control of the West and form some weird technocracy, totalitarian state. And we can talk a bit more about the reality of how China operates, which for people who live there, people who've been there, people who work there, they'll know what I'm saying is reality. I've spent a lot of time there in the last 20 years or so. I've worked there. I spent a lot of time understanding what China was doing and trying to take your Western blinkers off, so you understand that they don't think like us. They operate very differently, and the Chinese people pretty much like the way their nation is evolving. They don't care about having different political parties to vote for, because their attitude is the government's doing the things they've promised. They're improving my livelihood. They're improving our prosperity. They're improving us as a nation. We approve of this. We don't care if we don't get to vote. I mean, for some different political party, because they look at the West and go, well, things are getting worse. So what's the point of having this supposed democracy? So it's a different attitude. But again, they don't care. If the West wants that, the West can have that. That's their choice. They're not going to impose their will on other nations. But compared to what we've had to put up with for decades, this is a big improvement. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean it's not going to have blips in the road and problems to iron out and deal with. And and there is no doubt there are huge challenges that the world faces in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But this is an evolutionary process. And we're just, it's 2021. People in 100 years will talk about this time and reflect upon the absurdity of how the world largely operated.
Yes.
And this is an evolutionary process. It's an opportunity, and I call it a paradigm shift. And the one final point worth making is, and I've said this many times, as much as people talk about the financial aspects and geopolitical and trade investment and all those things, this is fundamentally more than anything a reboot in humanity's attitudes in how we engage, how we interact, how we treat each other. That is the fundamental turning point. And that's what the new reality wants to adopt. It doesn't want the old reality, which is divide and conquer within nations. Let's create a pseudo political structure that divides and conquers people. So everyone's opposing someone because you're a Democrat, Republican, Conservative, Labour, or maybe you're opposing each other on religious grounds or whatever it might be. It's all trying to divide and conquer people. And the new paradigm is we're kicking all that into the long grass. We don't want any of this anymore. And people say that's utopian. It will never happen. Well, it is happening, but it's a long gestation period. It doesn't happen overnight. And the other thing is, if you just sit there and say it's never going to happen, of course it'll never happen. But when you get nations with the tenacity to say, we'll strain every sinew to help make that happen, and you start to see it happening, then it proves it's possible, and it's never going to be completed in the next 10, 20, 30 years. But I can guarantee 10, 20, 30 years from now, the world will be an extremely different place and in a far better position than it is now, because the unipolar world is dead. It never took off. It never was. And all this idea of all these fanciful stories about what's going to happen in the world is not a reality. And if you think it's a reality, then China and Russia must be the biggest liars. I mean, everything they've done, particularly for the last decade or so, must be the biggest, most gigantic lie we've ever seen, because they're doing exactly the opposite, which proves this is the future, this is the new reality. But the old reality doesn't disappear overnight, and there are challenges to change that, people within that old reality. And it's, in some senses, it's kind of a profound point. I would arguably say it's probably the most fundamental change in 2,000 years of history. And maybe in our entire history, we don't, as parts of history, we don't know, and we're not going to get into that subject. Right. But I think it's that profound. And in a way, it's kind of an incredibly interesting time to be living on this planet.
Yep. Very well said, Paul. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Again, this has been a simulcast, the Sears Report on Rogue News, and we also carried it over to the Gadfly multi-channel network as well. It's just that important of a discussion. So loved all the conversation in the chat room. Thank you all for being here. And by the way, I have not done anything with V. He will be back next week. I promise you, he's still alive and kicking and doing well. But everyone have a great day. And Paul, thank you so much for a great discussion.
Yeah, pleasure was ours.